Race to zero!
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello and welcome to Outrage and Optimism. I'm Tom Rafik-Karnak.
I'm Christiana Figueres.
And I'm Paul Dickinson.
We are back with another episode in our Race to Zero series. Today, we are going to be delving into the all-important, crucial issue of finance. Thanks for being here. So listeners, we have a cracking episode for you today. This is going to be a really remarkable hour in which we're going to delve into one of the most important and consequential issues on climate change, and that is finance. Now, don't panic. Data suggests that finance is an issue that many people find incredibly intimidating and that they don't understand the language. There's a whole bunch of terminology.
And boring.
So
I'm not rich enough, so I haven't got any money anyway. So it's like, why you know?
However,
a complicated, impenetrable, boring issue. However, it could not be more important. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we're going to decide, or it is going to be decided whether or not we deal with this issue in time or not. And actually, what we've got for you today is a series of amazing conversations that are straightforward, that will help you understand what's going on, and that will demonstrate how we can move through these difficult issues to actually achieve the turning points that we need. It's all very exciting.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm going to quote three fantastic quotations, two from people.
You're giving us three quotations. Okay, sorry, carry on.
Well, they're quite short. I mean, it's not like an essay or whatever.
Settle down, listeners.
The first one is from the late, great Tessa Tennant, who was inspiration to many people, actually created the first in kind of environmental investment fund in Europe in 1988. And she said that finance was like a bird's eye view over the whole economy, that from finance you could see everything else, which I thought was an incredibly astute perspective. And then in 2003, Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State, was at a finance event, and she said, "Our business is to help investors vote with their money." And that went very deeply with me. You know, she's an academic and she's a politician. And she was speaking with a whole bunch of investment institutions in Swiss Re, and that's what she said. And then the third quote, I think I must have dreamt, because I've looked it up on the internet 100 times and I've never found it attributed to anybody.
It means you can claim it. This is a Paul Dickinson original.
Money is information about the future.
Okay.
Ooh.
Now, despite the slightly esoteric nature of those quotes, this is going to be an understandable episode, listeners, I assure you. Christiana.
I actually like the third quote more than the other two, and I think we should ascribe it to Paul. Paul, there you go.
I'll take it. If a listener wants to tell us where it comes from. Yeah?
You can put it out as a tweet.
His third tweet.
There's a lot of pressure building on me to do the third tweet, but I still think the first two are so perfect. Why take a risk?
Well, however, it is actually a fun episode, so we promise to edutain you on climate finance. Mm-hmm. You will be both informed and entertained by quite a few aspects of climate finance, and you will be brought up to date on where we are on this all-important issue.
There you go.
From movers and shakers from the world, big names. Is that right, Tom?
Absolutely. So in the course of the next 45 minutes or so, you're going to hear from Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, Amelie Amin, the Climate Change Director at CDC, the UK's development finance institution, Tom DiNapoli, the controller of the enormous New York State Pension Fund, the fourth largest pension fund in the US, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the CEO and chair of the Global Environment Facility. If you listen carefully, you may even also notice Nigel Topping dropping in, as he so regularly does on this podcast, and always a joy.
This is huge. I mean, honestly, there are so many important people in this podcast. They can't all travel in the same car or something. I mean, if this podcast was hit by a meteorite or something, that would probably be the end of green finance. So I'm just saying.
And our guide for the next hour will be none other than Christiana herself.
And we'll be back afterwards with some summary of what we thought.
So here we go. Christiana, take us away.
5, 4, 3, 2,
God. My God. Sorry about that.
Hello.
Do you hear me?
We do, Mark. We do.
Okay. How are you? Are you still in Costa Rica?
Yes, I'm planning on staying here. I will only move from my house if there's an intergalactic emergency. Otherwise, I'm not moving.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Okay.
I know that 2019 feels like a very long time ago now, but regular listeners of this podcast might remember our interview with Mark Carney all the way back in November of that year when he was still governor of the Bank of England.
Tell me what you want to do. And we last time we did this in the Bank of England. Can you imagine that?
I know. Now, Mark Carney is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. First time we've ever had a UN Special Envoy for climate finance. And Mark is also advising the UK government on mobilizing finance for COP26. We asked Mark how he is going to leverage the ambitious new Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ as an acronym, to set the finance system toward accelerated climate action. For the discussion with Mark, we were delighted to be joined by our good friend Nigel Topping, the UK's high-level climate action champion.
But to get to the heart of it, in terms of what I'm doing, I'll say two sentences on that. The first is working with others on the plumbing of the financial system so that every financial decision takes climate change into account. And so that's information, it's tools like stress testing, and it's new markets. So those three. But what we're talking about now is having the commitments, and not just the commitments, the actions to finance the path to net zero and accelerate that pathway. You know, what it is an alliance of alliances. When Nigel Topping and myself and others were thinking about the architecture for the financial system as it was evolving, as some alliances were setting up, and I think in many respects we look first to the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So those are the pension funds and the big life companies, the people who ultimately have our money. It's all our money in the end, but they're the ones who have the longest horizon. That being the first, moving into asset managers, but realizing, well, we don't really have an alliance of the standard of race to zero for the banks or for the insurance underwriters as well. So that's another alliance that's coming into being as part of GFANZ. But secondly, getting these pillars in place, absolutely necessary, and again, reinforce of the standard of race to zero, which is critical, the gold standard for a net zero commitment. It's the financial sector, so we need to have it coordinated between these various types of entities. We need a table where they can coordinate and be reinforcing more than the sum of their parts. And they can identify which elements of that plumbing I spoke about a moment ago is working well, what else is needed, what should be changed, and work on that in real time.
Mark, and as you look across the table at public finance, from where I sit, I see private finance as being able to provide the scale and the speed that is necessary, assuming that public finance plays its role. And that role is, I think, at least a two-part role. One is de-risking and accelerating private investment. But the other, which is going to play a huge role at COP26, is the political symbolism of public finance. And these 100 billion that have been plaguing us for such a long time. I'd love to know, if you're dealing there in the trillions, which we have to, because that's what we need, $1 trillion a year for transformation. If you're dealing in the trillions from the private side, how do you look across the table at public finance, both in terms of delivering the political promise that is basically the tail that wags the dog, because what are we going to do? 100 billion is not going to do anything, but it is the political symbol. And also, how do you see it, or what would you like to see in terms of what governments can do with public finance in order to accelerate and de-risk the private side?
Yeah, essential question, and I love the way you frame it. First, there is a symbolism and a solidarity that comes with, first and foremost, making the 100 billion, part of which related to multilateral development aid and other elements there. But first and foremost, making that, and that is a top priority of this COP, as you know, and needs to be met. Secondly, it is good news that the private sector is moving. It makes it more anomalous, more of an outlier, that not all of the multilateral development banks, not all of the development finance institutions are meeting their obligations under the Paris Accord, under it's 2.13C or 2.13C to be Paris aligned. The financial sector needs to be Paris aligned. And of course, these institutions themselves at the heart needs to be Paris aligned. And we need it now. And in part of your preamble, underscores the billions to trillions opportunity that comes with our multilateral development banks and development finance being Paris aligned and taking on elements of risk in investments in adaptation and mitigation in developing countries that unlocks much larger components of private finance alongside the so-called the blended finance. Now, blended finance it's sometimes talked about, it's almost like a holy grail. It's not a holy grail. We can find blended finance. We can unlock blended finance in a way. And I think, to the credit of the Italian presidency of the G20, and of course, Italy and the UK are working very closely together, as you know, for COP, is to take this issue on and put it on the table and really focus attention on how are multilateral development banks, for example, using their balance sheets in a way that, of course, does absorb risk. You have to absorb risk, but not risk that crowds out the private sector, but that opens up the private sector. And then secondly, as we know, and this is a big emphasis of this COP, rightly so, is we need a balance to that, those flows, a balance between adaptation and
mitigation,
and resilience, and really the 50-50 split. And that's, look, I'll be candid, I don't think we'll get a 50-50 split from the private sector flows on their own, but we can get a 50-50 split if we have the public flows and the blended flows aligned accordingly. We have to be very explicit and very deliberate about that. And I think it is now time to really, we have to do more than one thing at a time, of course, but to spend more attention on the public side.
Mark, talk about the need to be explicit. There's been sort of mixed reactions to the flurry of bold net zero commitments. I mean, particularly at GFANZ, as you said, 160 firms, 70 trillion. Can you say something about how people should navigate what is real net zero and what is greenwashing net zero, and how does GFANZ make sure that it's the real deal, not greenwashing?
Well, I think we're trying to make this simpler, and for the financial sector, which is the bit I and colleagues focus on, is it's a real net zero commitment if it's ultimately part of Race to Zero. So if it's part of a coalition that is part of Race to Zero, and for those who don't follow this as closely, and I can understand why some don't, there is a...
Wait, you mean that not everybody is obsessively following the Race to Zero?
Not everybody knows about Race to Zero. It is...
I have no idea. I'm having trouble just imagining that scenario.
I know.
I'm going to go outside and ask my gardener, for example. Excuse me, are you following the Race to Zero discussion?
By the way, everybody who listens to this podcast does know what Race to Zero is. We have me shouting Race to Zero with an echo and a round of applause, and it comes on every episode.
Okay, wow.
Right. Carry on. Sorry about that.
For the purposes of that rare individual, just for the avoidance of doubt, what this means, and let me use the example of what a real net zero commitment looks like. And I'll start with the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was set up last week as part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance. Net Zero. Okay, if you're a bank that is part of that alliance, and there's 43 banks from 5 continents and $28 trillion of balance sheet that are part of that, including some of the largest banks in the world, to their credit, founding members. If you're a bank as part of that, within, of course, you have committed to be net zero on all of your financed emissions. So all the people you lend to, not just your operations, but of course, what's really relevant with the big footprint, the people you lend to and their
portfolio.
operations. Yeah, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions for that portfolio. Of course, that's net zero by 2050. Okay, fine. But like countries, we are all very focused on this decisive decade. So where are you going to be by 2030? And if you're in Race to Zero, you have to be contributing your fair share of the 50% reduction that we need to get, the collective we need to get by 2030. So as a bank, you're also made that commitment. On top of that, you need to have a 5-year decarbonization plan for your assets. So that's not 2030, that's 5 years from now. On top of that, you need to, within 18 months, develop and release plans for your major exposures. So you go across your portfolio and here's my real estate exposure. And this is what's going to happen. This is my plan for decarbonization for that. Here's my exposure to the auto industry, for the energy industry, for the et cetera, and all the way across. And, now it's all out in the open and we're going to go out to all those other institutions that are not in yet. And I'm not criticizing them for not being in. They haven't necessarily had the chance. But by the time we get to Glasgow, they will have had a chance to make a decision whether or not they're into the gold standard for net zero and part of the solution or not.
Just a final really important point, which it's worth reminding everybody, which is, I know, dear to Paul's heart as the founder of CDP and yours with all the work you've done on the TCFD, is disclosure, right? Is that everyone who's joined GFANZ will have to publish progress reports every year through CDP, TCFD, whatever mechanism, but they'll have to be transparent, not just about their target and plans, but are they reaching their plans, so that they'll be held accountable.
Yes, and absolute emissions intensities, etc., PCAF standards, GHG. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
So, Mark, given the rigor of the, let's call it the entrance process that you have just described, one might be surprised that you have a current total of 70 trillion and a pretty good expectation that is going to grow from here to November. What is your interpretation of the motivation of these financial institutions? This is actually a heck of a lot of work for them. This is moving into unknown territory. Why are they doing it?
I'll give you my judgment. I think it's a combination of things. I think first,
they all want to talk to you personally. That's probably why.
Superstar bank.
I'm not sure after the last couple of weeks they want to talk to
Superstar Mark Carney
again. But that's okay. That's all right. That's okay. I can almost hear them switching off this podcast when they hear my voice.
Not so.
No. To their credit. I mean, I think we should give full credit to these institutions. Look, I think it's a combination of things. I do think it starts with a recognition. The world's changing, and the rebalancing from shareholder to stakeholders is an important element, and we have seen that. And it has shifted to different degrees in different societies, as you would expect. So you see at the vanguard, as in many things, have been European, UK institutions and others coming in. So that's the first element. I think the second thing, though, is that as part of this process, as part of the optimism side of your work and the podcast, is there a sense of where the world is today and where it's headed, which is we are taking this issue seriously, finally, and that is going to change the rules of commerce. It's not going to change because it's changing regulation, it's changing consumer behavior, it's changing the cost of being part of the problem for climate change. And it is very much, and this is where these institutions get more and more excited, and we're very happy about this, it is very much increasing the rewards to being part of the solution. So lending to a company or investing in a company that is going to decarbonize or provide decarbonization solutions is a smart thing to do. And these institutions are increasingly realizing that. And they're also realizing that for their own shareholders, lenders, employees, communities, that it's important that they are seen and and this is not window dressing, it's not virtue signaling, that they are seen to be part of that solution and pushing it. And I think the other reason why we've got, and some of the firms that came in, is that they have capabilities and expertise that go beyond. They don't just write checks. They understand how markets can work and how the plumbing of the system should work. And they want to be at the table in a way that helps it to work properly.
To design it.
Yeah, to help design it, or, I think we have a decent idea of which direction it should go, but there's a lot that matter. If we go from 30,000 feet to 5,000 feet, there's a lot of important detail in the 5,000 to landing the plane, in my metaphor. And having these institutions involved is critical. And I'll say one other thing, which is, it sounds like a nuance, but it's really important. And I mean this in the best possible way. Big institutions have large sustainability or ESG departments, or stakeholder departments have said various capable people. The discussions were all with the CEOs. The CEOs, this is a business line. This is a strategic issue. And so they're bringing the whole of their institutions to address this issue. Look, we need the money. This is about getting money to people who are going to help solve the problems, but we need that expertise, quite candidly. And that's, I think, it's the intangible element of last week's announcement that is almost as important, if not, and maybe in the fullness of time, it'll mean that the money is put to work in a way that's as effective as possible.
Interesting.
Yes, so CDC is the UK's Development Finance Institute. We're actually the oldest finance institute, DFI actually, in the world.
That is the voice of Amalie Amin, Director of Climate Change at CDC, the UK government's Development Finance Institute, not the US Center for Disease Control, despite the same acronym. Most industrialized governments have loan institutions that bilaterally support projects in developing countries, as well as public finance flows that go through multilateral development banks. Those financing channels provide vital resources for countries to pursue the national sustainable development goals that are ultimately in the interest of global stability. We have seen through the COVID crisis how when one country struggles, we are all impacted. We've also seen how important it is to interlink development and climate goals.
We were first established in 1947. We basically do private investments. We're an impact investor, and we only invest in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So really the poorest and, from a climate perspective, the most vulnerable countries in the world. And as I say, we just do private investments, which can be quite challenging because there aren't necessarily a lot of strong climate projects in those countries. So the climate team was created almost 2 years ago now, to establish a new climate change strategy for CDC. And what we've done is really step up the agenda for CDC, taking what was previously a focus on trying to integrate some renewables or energy efficiency into some of our investments, to actually taking a whole of organisation approach to how we address climate change. And we've set out a climate strategy that has 3 main building blocks, which set out our approach towards Paris alignment. The first building block is net zero, and to be net zero by 2050. The second building block is how we can invest more for a just transition, recognising particularly in many of our markets that where they're heavily reliant on coal at the moment, how we can help ensure that through our investments and through our influence as an investor, we can also help to deliver those investments that deliver a social and economic transition. And the third building block is how we can invest more in adaptation and resilience. both to increase the resiliency of our investments, but also more importantly now, that in terms of a big challenge, I think, for the private sector, but for DFIs, is how we can also support businesses that are going to bring forward the adaptation and resiliency solutions that are going to be needed by countries over the coming decades.
This is critical. To make all countries and communities truly resilient, the private sector will have to throw its full weight behind climate goals. But for full private sector involvement, governments have to pull the lever to activate it. This is where institutions like the CDC come in, using public funding to support developing communities and to support a drive towards a greener future of investment. Where government goes, the private sector will follow.
So most countries have what we refer to as a DFI, a Development Finance Institute, certainly in Europe. We work closely with our European peers, our EDFI, European DFIs, our EDFI peers. Also in the US, there is the Development Finance Corporation. And in fact, they have just announced a new climate strategy, which is very ambitious. We also work with the IFC, which is an international finance institution. So we also work with companies to help build their capabilities, particularly in climate change now, in helping them manage climate risk and increasingly looking at issues around Paris alignment and how they themselves can become more aligned in terms of their financial flows moving forward with the Paris Agreement goals. So climate change is, we see it very much as part of our development objectives to invest to ensure that those countries that we invest in can become part of the zero carbon economic transition that is underway globally, as well as be more resilient to climate impacts. But at the same time, as a financial institution, that we need to make a return on investment. So we can't provide grants. We provide loans. As we invest in companies, we bring not just finance, but also work with those companies to ensure that they really become successful. And so, of course, when we think about the climate agenda, that brings both risks that we need to help our companies address and manage, as well as opportunities that, again, increasingly we're working to support them to better identify those opportunities and then invest in those opportunities. We also do a lot of investment through funds as well as through financial institutions. So we can be a very strong partner to financial institutions in Africa, in Asia. Again, we bring finance, but we also bring our expertise. And so in this context, really helping those financial players to actually become much more aware, in the first instance, aware of the climate challenge, aware of the risks, and then starting to integrate those into their own strategies, both in terms of a risk management approach as well as in terms of pursuing opportunities.
We're an investor, right? So our goal is to seek out investment opportunities that will give us the return that we need to secure the retirement benefits for our 1.1 million members, the New Yorkers who are public workers, who we're investing for their retirement.
That is Tom DiNapoli, Comptroller and Trustee of the New York State Common Retirement Fund, which holds and invests the assets of the New York State and local retirement system on behalf of more than 1 million state and local government employees and retirees and their beneficiaries. The Asset Owners Disclosure Project ranks the New York State Retirement Fund third in the world and first in the U.S. among public pension funds in addressing climate change-related investment risks and opportunities. To do that, they have worked to engage with the companies they invest in rather than divesting from traditional industries and polluters.
So I would say we have an inclination to invest, right? Not to divest. And because we're big, right? We're the third largest public pension plan in the country, about $250 billion in assets. We have to be, in effect, a universal investor. And much of our public equity investments, which are the biggest part of our portfolio, are invested through index funds, passive investment, efficient, lower cost, easy way to deploy large chunks of capital. So all of that, given how most of the indexes are set up, if you start undoing the index by taking certain companies out, you pervert the value of the index. So all of that makes it hard for us to look at these issues from the perspective of divestment. Then you add on to it the other perspective that we've had for a long time, which is that because we are a pension fund, perpetual investment horizon, not only are we universal, but we're forever, we want to be in it for the long term with the companies we invest in. So getting them to be better corporate citizens, to change their policies on climate, on other issues as well, makes them attractive for us, as a sustainable investment. And because we're in it for the long haul, we have the patience to try to press them to change their corporate policies and practices. So the engagement role is one that we're comfortable with. We do that on many, many issues. All of that being said, because of the urgency on the risk of climate change, not only to the planet, but to the risk to our portfolio, right, and to our investments, and certainly being inspired by the work that you and Tom and others did to get the Paris Agreement, and I was privileged to be there at the time to see it all in action, we have evolved to the point where we say now there may in fact be some cases where engagement may not work, either because we've tried it and it doesn't work, or because the business model for the company we're invested in simply will not transition to what they have to do to be part of the emerging low-carbon economy. So we don't just look and say, all right, you're a fossil fuel company today, therefore we're going to pull out. We ask the question, are you comporting your business plan, your business practices, your future outlook to the emerging low-carbon economy? Are you going to be part of the change that we need to see globally? If you are, well, then we'll stick with you and we'll work with you. If you're not, and if your business plan just doesn't comport at all with how we see the future, well, then we're going to make the decision to pull out. So it is a more in-depth review before we make a decision on divestment, because we really do believe that needs to be the option of last resort, and we do think you can have success in pressing companies. We need a stable climate if there's going to be a stable global economy for us to invest in. I mean, it's certainly all tied together. So, I think we have more fully developed what we mean by fiduciary responsibility, but we have absolutely seen our work on climate to be key. We see the risk as not decades away. I mean, it's immediate. As you know better, you and Tom have been advocating. We've got to meet that 2-degree or better scenario sooner than later. We see governments and we see corporations talking about 2050. It needs to be sooner. That's why we pegged it at the year 2040, that we want to be net zero emissions for our portfolio.
Yes.
It's got to be a challenge to get there, but we want to set a strong goal for ourselves. And there's still time for us, I think, to achieve that, because we do get criticism sometime with what we're doing. And I say, I'm a fiduciary, and whatever decisions we're making on investing, divesting, engaging companies, advocating at a public policy level, certainly at the federal level, SEC level, and so on, it is tied to fiduciary responsibility.
I love that. You've been a leader for such a long time on climate. You've clearly thought this stuff through over more than 10 years. And you previously had a commitment to be net zero by 2050. Now, recently in December last year, you sharpened that to 2040. And the interesting thing about when a leader goes further is clearly you've thought this through. You know what's required to decarbonize your portfolio. And you looked at your target and you said, that's not ambitious enough. Can you talk us through how you made that decision to sharpen it, and also what others can learn from that new leadership that you're now exhibiting?
The more we've looked at the issue, Tom, I just feel we've really embraced a sense of urgency, about this issue. And in terms of sending a message to those that may have opportunities for us to invest in terms of climate solutions, I think we wanted to send a clear message how serious we are about that. Because one of the challenges is, sourcing opportunities, whether it's in, wind or solar, renewables, green bonds. I mean, go down the list of the kind of investments we're looking for. Sometimes we found it hard to find them. So part of our thinking was, if we make clear that we want to be a leader in this space, then we'll get more folks knocking on our door in terms of presenting us with opportunities. And we've seen that, and we're pleased by that. But I think, to the point of your question, what we've also seen is that we've gotten calls, from other pension funds, from other investors saying, hey, how did you get to that point? And, this has been a lot of hard work on our part and tremendous staff resources to not just say, I mean, look, in some ways, right, the simple thing some of the advocates, want to say, just look at fossil fuels, divest oil again. That's going to solve this problem. Well, no, as we looked at it, that's not going to solve the problem. We have to see a holistic change from an investment perspective, from an economic perspective. It's not just fossil fuel companies. It's the agriculture sector. It's the transportation sector. It's really every business sector. And if you only focus on the bad actors in fossil fuel, and you think you're going to deal with the climate issue, by just pulling out your stocks, that's, may sound easy, to think that that's going to be. It's not, So I think from our perspective, the move to make that commitment to the net zero by 2040 was really, again, part of our evolution in understanding the magnitude of the challenge and the value in setting an aggressive goal like that, because then that presses ourselves, right? It's a challenge to ourselves. What are we doing in terms of looking at our portfolio? How are we more aggressively engaging with companies? How are we more aggressively seeking out investments that comport with the low carbon economy that we envision for the future? So it's a marker out there that we hope others will follow. It's also an internal challenge, to my team to say, all right, we set that goal. Now, are we taking every step to achieve that goal?
I have two explanations as to why we are seeing stepped up engagement on climate and relentless pursuit of bringing more ammunition in this fight.
Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund today, previously CEO of the World Bank. She and I spoke on Earth Day about the future of climate finance, how we have to broaden our perspective on climate change from being a problem for environmentalists to a challenge that has to be taken seriously by every institution of society.
The first one is what COVID has presented to all of us to see is how interdependent we are and how dependent we are on Mother Nature. And that realization, the soberness of re-evaluating what matters in life as a result of COVID, has helped many who might have been less interested in the issue of climate change to join with you and me and others. And secondly, we have made tremendous progress in the economic and ethical case for climate action together. There has been a long time of the ethical case standing up, but climate being seen more as an environmental issue that environmentalists need to handle. Now it is for institutions like the IMF a core mainstreamed issue. Why? Because we now have all the data we need about the risks and about the opportunities. And we also have what matters tremendously, a source of optimism that action is possible. What would it take to meet the Paris Agreement, the one you delivered? And what this research shows is it is doable. We need a combination of three things. One, carbon price with forward guidance, so we start low, but businesses and consumers know the price is going to go up and up. Today, the average carbon price per ton, as you know, is about $2. By 2030, it has to be at least $75 a ton. But we have 10 years to go in this direction. Second, an investment push towards green. Now, we need this push to get out of the pandemic, of the crisis that we are experiencing today. Why not make it green? And if we go for a green investment push, combined with carbon price, we can generate additional growth of 0.7% a year for the next 15 years, plus at least 12 million net jobs, new jobs. And that has to be paired with what you know very well from negotiations, making this to be a just transition. That there will be losers. There are industries, communities that are impacted negatively by the transition from higher to lower carbon intensity. But if we use some of the revenues generated from carbon price to help reskill, reprofile industries, bring science to help accelerate this reduction of carbon intensity, it can be done. So you have these three pillars, and they can work in a way that actually makes us better off, not worse off as a result. And that fits into your stubborn optimism, into my optimism about moving forward. Recognizing, though, that we have to very carefully pay attention to all the three aspects of our journey. Mitigation, very important. Transition, hugely important. But also adaptation, equally important. So at the IMF, we look at our engagement with countries. If they are high emitters, we concentrate on mitigation and transition. If they're highly vulnerable, we concentrate on adaptation. And by doing so, we bring the membership together. One message I heard, and I know you have heard it in negotiations many times, is please be mindful of different conditions in different countries. It has to be fair. And to finish on fairness, we also have to deliver the 100 billion a year promised between now and 2030 to the developing world, so we can all pool our forces and do what your book talks about.
Based on my experience, the most relevant element is you need to be able to present the economic case upfront, so you can begin.
Carlos Manuel, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Is there any way we could silence the dogs? Yeah.
The cat ran away, so.
Okay. So sorry to interrupt.
The cat ran away, therefore the dogs are barking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, beyond the barking of his beloved dogs, the final interview in this episode is with Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, a fellow Costa Rican good friend and currently the CEO of the Global Environment Facility. Carlos has dedicated his career to creating equitable financial systems to protect and regenerate the natural environment and the communities who steward nature. From his experience in Costa Rica, he has first-hand knowledge of the lasting impact that finance can have in combating the climate crisis. Bueno, Carlos Manuel, qué lindo tenerlo acá en el podcast. What a pleasure to have you on our podcast. I think just for listeners' delight or frustration, we just conduct this whole conversation in Spanish. ¿Qué te parece?
Oh, that sounds great to me. Suena muy bien. Sounds great to me.
Well, these poor podcast listeners are used to me singing the praises of Costa Rica, and now we have two Costa Ricans on together, so that's going to be rather difficult for people to digest. But Carlos Manuel, I'm very interested by the fact that after you left the ministry here in Costa Rica and you went to the GEF website calls you lawyer by profession, politician by choice, and conservationist at heart. What happened to surfer by passion? Why is that not there?
Yes, the surfer, let me explain you. The surfer is not a sport. It's a lifestyle.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I began surfing in the late 70s in Costa Rica, where nature, even though the forest was destroyed because of the development and rural policies, where destroyed the ocean was pristine back then. And I remember my couple of first years surfing that we were very concerned about sharks. We saw sharks everywhere. We used to surf in coral reefs and river mouths, and the bull shark and the hammerhead sharks was something that we were very much afraid. At the same time that I was very, very concerned that everywhere I went in Costa Rica, I saw forest fires and people destroying the forest because there were many policies for the expansion of the agriculture frontier. I never knew that, in the late 80s, the same thing was going to happen in the ocean. Right? All of a sudden, we never saw more sharks. The sharks were fish out of the ocean. And it took me like 20 years to have a north thread in the water, which is a very nice story. Because I went from sharks to crocodiles. The sharks were fish out. When I grew up surfing, there were no crocodiles because they were all hunted. And then all of a sudden, like 15 years ago, we began seeing crocodiles everywhere. And that is because of the good conservation policies. Having been a witness of how this country managed properly and inappropriately their natural resources had a big, big impact in me. Surfing has helped me understand much better the impact of climate change, because as the ocean rises, the waves change. So, surfers, we feel we are a victim of climate change. That's why we need to back for the 1.5.
You've now stepped into to the GEF responsibility and stepped into the continuous rounds of replenishment that the GEF has had. And it's our understanding that you've just finished your first meeting that prepares for the 8th replenishment round. You will have to bring that funding cycle to a close by July of next year. So just wanted to ask you, yes, you still have a year to work on this, but what is your feeling on the country's, the government's willingness and truly expanded understanding of the importance of replenishing the GEF? Or where are you? Are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? Are you frustrated? Where are you on that?
Well, probably you're a little bit of a stubborn optimist. I'm a rational optimist.
Okay.
And the science is there. The financial resources are there. And now, more than ever, the political willingness and commitment is there. We need to really stop investing in those activities, economic and development activities that contribute to climate change and generate a loss of biodiversity. Let me give you the numbers with respect to forest conservation. We humans invest 158 times more resources in activities that generates deforestation than what we invest in forest conservation. 80% of that is related to cattle ranching and agriculture. So the first thing that we need to do at the global level that will help us in every single agenda is shifting shifting this mindset and this and being able to engage policymakers in understanding that we need to defund those activities that contribute to climate change and biodiversity loss, which is more than just dealing with the issue of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Is way more than that. This is very well embedded into our system. In tropical forests, there's still a lot of incentives, perverse incentives that allow through land grabbing and other mechanisms to expand deforestation. So this should be, our most important approach, dealing with development policies, dealing with the different sectors. It's not just an issue of subsidies. There are hidden subsidies, and most importantly, dealing with the banks, particularly with development banks. Because as opposed to commercial banks, with development banks, we've got an advantage, which is the fact that development banks has just one shareholder, which is the government. And if we are able to engage with the government, we can change things. The investment will be low and the return will be high.
Has that as a financial instrument been used as much as it could? Or is there still a lot of runway, a lot of headroom for payment for ecosystem services to help us with land degradation, with reforesting, with stopping deforestation? Is that something that you think is promising? And if so, in theory, where would the funding come from?
We have heard the carbon tax many times, Christiana, but for me, that's a northern concept. There's a possibility to develop what I call the tropical carbon tax, which is different to the northern concept. In the north, the tax is, the aspiration is to increase the price, make more efficient consumption of fuels, and finance the transition. The tropical carbon tax is different. A tropical carbon tax deals with the market failure. You have a forest, you own a forest, you're a small farmer, indigenous community, or a large owner of forest. No, you don't receive any compensation for the services you provide. So let's put a tax that goes to a forest fund. That fund pays them for those services, water, biodiversity, and carbon. You will create a positive incentive to people to keep forests, and we will be, on track for the 1.5. We'll be on track for 30%. We'll be on track to many goals. We need to level the economic playing field for this instrument to be able to really deliver. When I'm talking about leveling the economic field, I'm thinking, we need to have a good plan on how do we do the transition and shift the tax burden from taxpayers to polluters. As we do that, we will move the whole system into a proactive system. Today, I believe that it is incredibly interesting how the financial sector, the capital sector, are really recognizing that they cannot continue investing in those sectors that are destroying nature and contributing to climate change. Just that is fabulous. 2 years ago, we didn't have that mindset or the understanding.
That is definitely where we should be moving toward. Question is, can we move in that direction quickly enough? Pero the path is clear. Carlos Manuel, thank you very much for sharing all of that.
Muchas gracias por todo, Cristiana. Un abrazo, estamos a las órdenes.
Un abrazo.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Ciao, bye.
So this year, when this crucial year in this crucial decade, and we keep saying and we keep referring to the importance of this moment, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that really, if we're going to make this turn, if we're going to deal with this issue now in a timely way, it's going to be because we get the financing right. What did you guys come away from that remarkable hour of insight and reflection from some of the world's deepest thinkers who are really grappling with this issue and trying to find a way forward for us all?
Well, I'm circling back to Paul's start and his quote of our dear friend Tessa Tennant, saying that finance is the overview of everything, with which I agree. And at the same time, I've always thought that finance is actually at the basis of everything, because whatever is financed gets built. Where, I'm wont to saying, wherever money goes, so go emissions, or so go emission reductions. And we've been grappling with this finance issue for years. And every time, and Tom, you will remember that at every COP, right? This has always pulled the short end of the stick. It's always been the very, very difficult issue at every single negotiation. And perhaps, a COP is not the best place to solve this, but it is a part of it, because there's a part of the climate finance that is the political symbol, and those are the 100 billion, very, very small amount. Sort of, I've always thought of the tail that wags the dog, but the dog of climate is truly the trillions that we need, $1 trillion dedicated to this per year for the next few decades. And what is delightful about this conversation that we've just had is that the trillions are now in the conversation. We used to only write about them or speak about them, but now we're beginning to see the trillions appear. And I think that is huge progress. Whether those trillions will be deployed into clean, green technologies in a space of time that actually makes a difference, i.e. over the next 9 years, remains to be seen. But the good news is that is now part of the conversation.
That sets up the significance of this enormously. And, there were a couple of comments that leapt out at me. One of them was, a couple of them were for Thomas DiNapoli from the New York State Comptroller's Office. That giant pension fund. I remember actually very early on in my career, in 2001, in climate change, I was sat in that office, one of the staff of that organization, and I remember I was just trying to get my head around the fact there were like more than $200 billion in this organization, and I was looking at the stapler on the table, and those kind of things where you just think random thoughts. I was thinking, that stapler is probably the last stapler to ever run out of staples in the whole world. They're sitting on $200 billion. There's such a kind of enormous financial power represented by the office of Thomas DiNapoli and then the 1.1 million public employees whose retirement savings that they're looking after. So I was fascinated when he's talking about engagement with companies, not just like selling them, which you could do. You could say this company's doing a bad thing, you could sell it, or you could engage with the board. I think that's a fascinating area. He talked about a more developed idea of what fiduciary responsibilities would be, which I thought was really incredibly interesting. The duty to invest in the best interest of the citizen. What does that really mean? And I was most excited because I'm a total academic investment geek. I was most excited when he talked about they are a universal investor, that they're investing perpetually. There's no end date for the state of New York, and they're thinking about the entire economic system of the United States and to some extent the world, and they might even be prepared to intervene in those systems to protect them and to make sure that climate change doesn't, rip the bottom out of your pension, frankly. So that was pretty exciting hearing Thomas DiNapoli talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what an amazing leader. He's been at this for such a long time, just putting his neck out, making stuff happen. It also struck me, I mean, these are amazing leaders who are finding a way to find the levers that transition finance to actually make it in service of humanity's aims, right? Which is to have a livable, healthy climate where we can all thrive. And these systems that we've constructed, it takes a long time to transition them and make them fit for purpose for the future, right? And it's just such an interesting challenge because it takes a while to get them to a tipping point, but it just feels to me now, and Christiana, you referenced this, back in Paris, this wasn't the case. We talked about theoretical trillions that would be deployed towards the solutions in the future, but it feels now like we are so close to that tipping point where there just will not be financing available for the past. It will only be available for the future. We will invest in the technologies, we'll deploy the solutions, the degree of support and help. That's really the moment at which the ball starts running down the other side of the hill. We really start to make progress towards the outcomes that we want. Of course, we then need to give real attention to justice and equity and all these other different issues that need to come along with transitioning the global economy. But I thought this was a hugely optimistic episode. I really felt positive about the future.
Yeah, and to add to the scale, right? Because I think we're at the scale that we need to be. But the other huge shift in this conversation for me is not just the scale or the quantity, but the quality of this conversation, because we have grown up thinking around a paradigm of money for profit, right? You just put it very simply. You have the money, you invest it, and it's there for profit. And the fact that there is a nascent, not yet completely settled, but a nascent shift over to money for purpose, that paradigm shift is absolutely essential and will be so transformational in this century. And we're witnessing it right now. We have been having these conversations, listening to these leaders, where basically they are helping to push toward money for purpose in addition to profit, not instead of, but basically for both there, or to be completely complete for profit, purpose, and planet. And that's a major shift that we're seeing there.
And it's interesting there that the purpose shift is happening at the same time that the way you generate profit is also moving to the way, so those that convergence is what's making the difference.
Self-reinforcing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
If I can quote a tiny bit of a speech delivered in 1987 from Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop, who was very brilliant. And she said in the Universal Hall in the Fintorn Foundation, she said, "I don't just want something to invest in, I want something to believe in." And I think that it's that combination, that this is not some kind of technocratic, machines just digging stuff out the ground and like humans aren't involved. No, companies are real. Stuff happens. You invest money in the stock market, stuff happens, and that we've got a responsibility for that, but that's also an opportunity. The other one I just wanted to pick up on, it was just brilliant to hear Kristalina Georgieva of the International Monetary Fund talking about, she said, today the average carbon price per ton, as you know, is about $2. By 2030, it has to be at least $75 a ton. And I just couldn't agree with her more. We, in some senses, we need new laws and regulations to make the maths work, and then all the money will flow. People have often said to me before, "Oh, Paul, do you think investors care about, greenhouse gas emissions?" And I say, they'll care exactly as much as the money that's attached to them. But I think we're going to get there. But I also noticed with all these great systems and these giant funds and the hundreds of billions of dollars, we're just children, we're just older children, really. And we've made one kind of system for ourselves, and we've got to change it really quickly. Yeah. And recognize that, these banks or something may be 300 years old or something, but we were born recently and we've got a problem. And Houston, we're going to change direction. To quote the famous phrase from the space program, which many people will be too young to pick up on.
So, I think this has been great. And so I would like to say thank you to all our listeners for coming with us on this journey. These Race to Zero episodes have been so amazingly fun to put together. I would like to say a big thanks to our team at Global Optimism. These episodes take a lot of work, and people have been working really hard on pulling these together. So thank you, everyone, for putting this work together. Hope you have enjoyed it. This has been a special Race to Zero episode on finance. Next week, we'll be back as usual. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
So there you go. Another episode of Outrage and Optimism. My name is Clay. I'm the producer of this podcast. If this is the first time that you're listening, thank you so much for joining us. This is our 100th episode, and actually our second anniversary of being a podcast, or birthday, or whatever people are saying. But what I'm trying to say is welcome to the party. So this was the third episode in our Race to Zero series. You can find all the other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And as of this exact moment, while I'm recording this, we have 99 other episodes for you to enjoy. That's a lot of episodes. Trust me, I edited all of them. So dig into our podcast feed and enjoy. This podcast is a Global Optimism production. But who's Global Optimism? It's Sarah Law, Katie Bradford, Lara Richardson, Marina Mancilia-German, Sophie McDonald, Freya Newman, Sarah Thomas, Sue Reed, and John Ward. And our hosts are Cristiana Figueres, Paul Dickinson, and Tom Rivet-Karnak. Our executive producer is Sharon Johnson, and this episode was produced by Clay Carnell and your new best friend, Daniel Curtis. If you're loving this series and our podcast, it means the world if you could leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And be sure to find us on social media at Global Optimism. The links to all of our social media are in the show notes. Thank you to our guests this week, Amal Lee Amin, Thomas DiNapoli, Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, Mark Carney, Kristalina Georgieva, and, of course, Nigel Topping. Okay, that's the credits for this week. Thanks for listening. Tomorrow, we have a bonus episode coming your way. We're going to reflect on the last year, celebrate our 100th episode and second anniversary birthday thing. We'd love for you to join us. So hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.